on the link, and we want you to know that we haven't forgotten you, that we appreciate you watching. And those that live within Cooey of Adelaide, we would like to invite you to come here in real life, and we'll promise to give you lunch as well. So that's a bonus, isn't it? All right, well, you can see the title, The Year That Changed the Modern World. People say to me, well, that's got to be 1989. And the reason they say that is because that's when Tiananmen Square took place, remember? Under the orders of the communistic government, over 1 million young people had assembled there in that square, and they, under the orders from the communistic leadership, they opened fire and thousands of Chinese young students were killed. That's 1989. Well, you say 1989, that's the year when Poland, Catholic solidarity in Poland, overthrew the communistic regime that had been there for 44 years. And basically through Eastern Europe, the communistic dictatorships were all overthrown, except in one area, and that was Romania. And the Stalinist regime in Romania finally was overthrown, and its leader was shot dead with his wife by the forces on December 25, 1989. 1989 was when the Berlin Wall fell down. 1989 was the year when John Paul II believed that it was the Virgin Mary that allowed them to overcome communism. But 1989 is not the year that changed the modern world. Important as all the events that we've mentioned were and are as far as history is concerned. Well, people say to me, well, what about September 11? That was significant, and it was. In fact, just this week, we have celebrated the anniversary of September 11. But September 11 came and went, and while it did have significance, it didn't change the modern world much at all. I'm going to suggest to you, and then I'm going to establish it very clearly, I think, in your thinking, that the year that changed the modern world was 1844. And I'm going to show you that from history and from the events that happened. If you've got your Bible, I'd like to encourage you to open it to Daniel chapter 8, and I'll read you the background. We're not going to go into this prophecy this morning. That's not my purpose. But I would like to encourage you, and perhaps in the future we will. This is Daniel chapter 8 and verse 12. And it says this: because of transgression, an army was given over to the host and the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. And he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said unto me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now, here is a prophecy which talks about two very important things. The truth of God and the sanctuary were going to be trodden underfoot. Now, what does that mean? If I was to tread something down underfoot, what would you immediately know how I regarded that? Would I be regarding that as important or not important? Not important at all. Trample it underfoot. Well, the Bible says that the truth of God and the sanctuary were going to be trodden down for 2,300 prophetic days or years. And at the end of that prophecy, God was going to restore the sanctuary and he was going to restore truth that had been trampled down all those long years. Now, if you've studied the Bible at all, you will know that one of the tactics that the devil has used over the years is to counterfeit the truth of God. Now, we all understand a counterfeit. A counterfeit is something that looks like the real thing, but it's not the real thing. And the devil has counterfeited every truth that's in the Bible. I can show you very clearly from practices in the world today how that every truth has been counterfeited. And the devil uses diversion tactics. Now, remember the Christians who were living in the year 1844 and the lead up to that period in history. There were very many sincere Christians of every denomination. There were Methodists and there were Presbyterians and there were Anglicans and there were Catholics. And wonderfully good people. Every one of those churches represented wonderfully good Christians. And these Christians had believed and were believing that in 1844, in fact on October 22, 1844, that Jesus was going to come back to this earth. Now, I want to remind you something that's very important. There were no Seventh-day Adventists in that movement. Seventh-day Adventists have never, ever set a date for the coming of Jesus. The people who set the date for the coming of Jesus were the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Catholics. They were good people. I'm not being critical of them. I'm just saying they were the ones who set the date for the coming of the Lord. And then, as we know from history, unfortunately, Jesus didn't come. We may say fortunately, otherwise we would never have been born, would we? But Jesus didn't come on October 22, 1844. And in history, this is known as the Great Disappointment. Now, you can appreciate that if you believe that Jesus was going to come back on a certain date, and you sold up your business, you sold up your farm, you gave everything to the cause, and Jesus didn't come, would you be disappointed? Absolutely. Devastated is the word. And that's what happened. And many of those Christians that were living at the time, some gave up their faith in God. They said, oh, the whole thing's a lot of nonsense. The Bible's not true. Other Christians then began to persecute and to ridicule those who continued to believe it. But there was a group who remained faithful and they said, look, it's not the Lord that's wrong. It's not the Bible that's wrong. There's something wrong with our understanding of it. So in 1848, that's 4 years after 1844, they formed a group which is known in history as the Sabbath Conferences. Now, the Sabbath Conference was made up of these Methodists, Anglicans, Presbyterians, and these good people, Catholics, these good people of all these churches. They came together and they said, what is wrong? We need to study this more carefully. And so they began in 1848. What went wrong? And as a result of that conference, a theology was born. A theology of understanding. They studied the Bible extremely carefully. And they made some amazing discoveries. Remember that the Bible said for that 2,300-year period that the truth of God was going to be trodden down. And in 1844, God raised up an understanding, and the years that followed, God raised up an understanding in the minds of the people to restore this trodden down truth that had been neglected and in many cases completely misunderstood. And as a result of the Sabbath Conference, they came to the conclusion that there were 5 vital, important truth. 5. Let me mention them. The first one was the sanctuary doctrine. Now, when they began to understand the sanctuary, and I wouldn't be surprised that some of us hardly know what we're talking about when we talk about the sanctuary. But the sanctuary doctrine, as they began to study it, they found a very, very clear understanding of the plan of salvation that they had never fully understood before. They had understood some things, but they hadn't understood in its breadth. And when they studied the sanctuary, it helped them to understand that. And as a result of studying the sanctuary, they then became very clear in their mind about the second coming of Christ. And while they believed that Christ was coming, they never understood the second coming of Christ. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been teaching that Christ was coming back in October 22, 1844. And so the second great truth that came out of the Sabbath conference was the second coming of Jesus. The third great truth that came out of the Sabbath conference was the Sabbath, because all of them had been brought up, like many of us, to keep Sunday. And they began to study the Sabbath. The fourth great truth was man's state in death, because they had believed, like many of us have been taught, that when a person dies, they go either to hell or to heaven. And when they began to study the Bible very carefully, they found that the Bible teaches that we sleep until Jesus comes back. That was the fourth great truth. And the fifth great truth was the truth on the spirit of prophecy. Now, it is these 5 great truths that form the basis of what we believe today. And over the years, there have been some, particularly of latter times, who have become a little unsure about some of these foundation truths. I have met some folk who have become, maybe I could use the word disillusioned. On the other hand, I have met hundreds and hundreds of young people who, when they come to grasp and understand these things, become a power in the church. And you see, all through the Bible, God has told us that truth is always going to be in conflict. The devil is never going to allow these truths, these fundamental truths, to go without being challenged and without being ridiculed. In fact, if we read over here in Revelation chapter 12, it says very clearly there, and the dragon was enraged with the woman. Now, in Bible prophecy, what does the woman represent? Church. I don't think anyone will doubt that. But the dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring. In other words, God's faithful people down through the years will carry right through until the end of time, and there's still going to be a faithful group of people who will be faithful to Jesus and faithful to his commandments. And that's why it says there very clearly, the rest of her offspring, who are characterized by 2 outstanding characteristics. You know, if you're looking for truth these days, it's very, very simple, because the Bible says it's only in 2 major areas. One is they keep the commandments of God, and the second is they have the faith of Jesus Christ. And if we're looking for truth, that's what we need to be looking for. You see, God's message is so simple and so clear. You pick up the book of Revelation. There's nothing doubtful about Revelation. It is just simple and clear. And so the devil has tried to pervert and to change things. You know, it says in Revelation 14, we're to give glory to God. We're to worship him that made the heavens and the earth. The hour of God's judgment has come. These are the fundamental teachings of what the book of Revelation is all about. And the devil realised that if I don't destroy this message, it will destroy my kingdom. So he set about with his angels to try to divert people's attention from these messages in the last days. And it's interesting to notice the strategies that he has used. The first thing he did was to bring in a second theology against the theology of the Sabbath conference. He then brought in a change of that. But he realised that that was not really going to last too long, because he realised that those who love the Lord would soon recognise the difference between the truth and the error. So then he came up with a second strategy. And the second strategy was to pervert the truth, to try to change it. And that was very successful with many Christians. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. The third strategy that he came up with, and this was extremely successful, the third strategy was to make those who were giving the message lukewarm and relaxed about the whole thing. They were no longer being on fire for God. In other words, a sleepiness, of lukewarmness came across many of God's leaders. Because as we look at the Sabbath conference and we look at the message that was given, we notice some very interesting characteristics. Now, what was the year that we have decided was important? The year that changed the modern world, what are we suggesting is the date? 1844. Now, it's interesting that in August 1844, remember that date? August 1844, two men met in a cafe in Paris. Their names were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Have you heard of them? I'm sure many of you have. If you haven't, then you need to understand some things that happened as a result of that meeting in that cafe in Paris in 1844. Very, very significant. In fact, Engels wrote to Marx, and this is what he said: "We are at present holding public meetings all over the place to set up societies for the advancement of the workers. By a large majority, everything Christian was banned from the rules." So Engels and Marx decided that they were going to have nothing to do with Christianity. Then he went on to say, "The criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism, and we are working for the abolition of religion and for real happiness." Now, this message or this teaching arose in 1844. God had given a message to go to the world, to every nation, kindred, tongue and people, and now we find in that very same year, Engels and Marx meet together and form what is known today as communism. And communism is not dead yet. And by the way, he said that this will bring an abolition of religion and for real happiness. In other words, if what Engels and Marx believed was true, then we ought to go to North Korea and Russia and China and find every citizen beaming with happiness. I'd like to suggest it's the very opposite. Most people in China, North Korea and Russia would leave tomorrow if they could. But that arose in 1844. And the Marxist system is not dead here in Australia. While we've got the CTSMU and other unions practicing here in this country that still have the hammer and the sickle as their symbols today. Communism is not dead. But that's not going to appeal to everyone, and we're going to notice that how the devil has brought in isms that appeal to different people, because communism is not going to appeal to everybody. And a perversion of Christianity is not going to appeal to everyone. So now the devil went after the intellectuals. And the intellectuals, you've heard of Charles Darwin, I'm sure. Do you know that Charles Darwin wrote the first sketch of his thesis on the origin of species in 1844? The very year that God announced the fact that we are to worship God who made the heavens and the earth as our creator God, that very same year, Charles Darwin writes the first sketch of his origin of species. And tell me how much of the world has really fallen for that. I've got to say, I find it very difficult personally to believe that people can actually intellectually accept the fact that everything that we have comes from nothing. I just find that incomprehensible. And then we have the Dawkins and the Hawkins. Remember, Dawkins was the head of science at Oxford University, and Hawkins. You may remember Hawkins. He was the fellow in the wheelchair, remember that? Now, he has died, of course, subsequently, but it was those two men who joined together and formed a society that they called the Brights. And what they were saying was that any person who taught or believed in a supernatural is not bright. In fact, just listen to what Dawkins himself says in one of his books. God almost certainly does not exist. Now just think about that for a moment. God almost certainly does not exist. Have you ever heard such nonsense? Because either God is there or he's not there. There's no in between. Because he's too scared, I believe, to say that God completely doesn't exist. And so the devil, as we're going to notice now, this year 1844, this is why we say that the year 1844 has changed the world more than any other single year. And I'm going to give you much more evidence yet. But we've found that communism arose in that year. That's the year that evolution was began to be taught. But the devil was after Christians now. And this time, in what year are we talking about? 1844, the devil raised up a man called John Nelson Darby. Now, Darby taught what is referred to in Christian circles today as dispensationalism. Now, you don't have to remember that. I'm just saying that's when this word came really into use in the Christian church. Now, dispensationalism teaches that they believe the world is divided into 7 periods. Right from Adam, right down to our day, it's been in 7 periods. And you can see them on the screen there. And God has dealt with his people, they believe, in different ways in those different periods. Get the idea? Now, today we're living in the period of the church and the Jews, according to them. They believe that God is dealing with the church at this present time, and it's not until the rapture takes place and you've heard of the secret rapture, that God is going to rapture his people away, and then after he has raptured his people away, the tribulation takes place, and God then is going to deal with the Jews. That's why, if you've been paying any attention to America and this shooting that took place just yesterday or the day before, has to do with this very thing. Because evangelical Christianity is teaching that the Jews have to go back to Jerusalem. That's why you'll always find Mr. Trump and America will be 100% behind the Jews. Because his base that's supporting him is the Christian right. And this man that was shot was one of the really extreme Christian rights. And this is what they believe. And it comes out of this teaching of dispensationalism. Now, J.N. Darby did not originate that teaching at all. It originated by the Jesuits in the Roman Catholic Church. That's where it originated. And it was brought into being as a result of the Reformation to counter the Reformation, to counter what Luther and Wesley and all of these men were teaching. Get the idea? Because they were teaching exactly what Seventh-day Adventists believe about the coming of Jesus. Exactly the same. And therefore, the devil wanted to counter that teaching. And that's why in history it's known as the Counter-Reformation. And the Jesuits taught that the coming of Jesus as taught by the Reformers and by the Protestant Church was totally incorrect. And part of their teaching, of the Jesuit teaching, is this word that you can see on the screen now, antinomianism. Now, once again, I'm sorry I have to use one or two big words, but if you're going to do any thinking and reading about this, you'll come across this type of word. Antinomianism simply means to be against the law. And the teaching that the law's been done away with, which you've all heard Christians teach, that teaching originated with the Jesuits as far as dispensationalism is concerned. And that's why it is so rampant. And any friends that you have in the Baptist church, the Pentecostal and so forth, they pretty well, to a last man, have accepted the teachings of dispensationalism. And so in order to help them to understand the truth, we've got to wade through all of this. And those of us who have to help people to wade through it know the difficulty that this presents often in their thinking. But the devil also realised that if he was going to make his teaching popular, it needed to be vibrant. And so in New York, the rappings began. And that was in 1844, and then in 1848, that very house where the rappings were going on in Hydesville in New York was later taken over by the Fox sisters. And you've heard about the Fox sisters because they were the ones who were the founders of what we call today modern spiritualism. All began around about the very same date. Now, I meet some Christians, if you please, and I know you'll find this hard to believe, many of you will, but do you know that there are some Christians who want to suggest to us that 1844 doesn't matter a rap? A modern teaching that's going around is that 1844 doesn't matter. Well, I like to remind those people, if you think 1844 doesn't matter, there are two people in the universe that it matters very much to. The first person that 1844 matters is God. That's the first person. But the second person is the devil. Why would he be bringing all these counterfeits into the world in 1844 if 1844 doesn't matter? At the very year God's message was raised up, the devil now has brought in all these counterfeits in the very same year. That's why I'm very, very convinced that 1844 is absolutely correct. And then the devil had another diversion, this time in the year 1830, a man by the name of Joseph Smith. Ever heard of him? And Mormonism was born, the Mormon church. And he taught that we are divine and we follow the order of Melchizedek. And if you know a little history, you'll know that he was assassinated in 1844. Now, of course, we've got to deal with the remnants of that today. Then we have the Baha'i faith. Now, that began in Iran, in Persia. The teaching of the Baha'is is that the Bab, as he is known, he taught that Moses was a prophet. He said that Jesus Christ was a prophet. And then he said Muhammad was a prophet. And he said, I'm the modern prophet. And if you haven't ever heard much about Baha'is, let me tell you that they have buildings in most of our capitals today. I don't know about Adelaide. I haven't seen one here in Adelaide. Does anyone know about the Baha'is here in Adelaide? May not be. And that faith was proclaimed by this young man. In around 1844, in fact in 1848, was when the feminist movement began. And the ecumenical movement came into being in that very decade. All these movements all began in and around 1844. Now, let's go back to the year 1844, and we find a Seventh-day Baptist lady by the name of Rachel Oakes. There she is on the screen. Now, she challenged a Millerite. He was a preacher for the Millerites, and she challenged him about the Ten Commandments. She said, do you believe in the Ten? Yes, said Frederick Wheeler. I believe in the Ten Commandments. Well, then she challenged him about the fourth commandment. And he began to study it and to look into it. And in the year 1844, he preached the first sermon on the Sabbath. So the Sabbath was restored in 1844. In 1844, Charles Fitch accepted the biblical teaching of soul sleep because he hadn't believed that prior to his study of the Bible. In 1844, the spirit of prophecy was restored in the church. All in that very year, 1844. Sometimes people say to me, well, Geoff, do you think that God might have another prophet before Jesus returns? I'll tell you my answer to that is I don't believe so, and I'll tell you why. If you go back to the type of the Exodus movement, which the New Testament says, Paul says, is an illustration of God's church in the last days, you will find that that was a one-prophet movement. Also, the prophet died just before they went into the promised land. Is that right? And that prophet was raised in a special resurrection. That's why he was able to come down to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses. And Moses, through God, gave them the health message. He gave them the message on simplicity of dress. All the teachings that are believed today by God's people Every last one of them was taught in the Exodus movement. There's not a single one that you can find an exception to. Every one. And because it was a one-prophet movement, I believe that on the basis of the type and the antitype, this will be a one-prophet movement too. You know, as people began to study this more and more, they found the great teaching of the sanctuary. That was restored in 1844, in that same year. And as these great truths came forward, then the devil was trying to bring in counterfeits. Can you see what the devil is doing? He knows that no two people's minds are exactly the same. You know, we all see things differently. And so the devil knows that. So what appeals to you may not necessarily appeal to me, and vice versa. So that's why the devil made all these isms, all these counterfeits, because he doesn't mind whether you believe in communism or evolution or that you believe in the secret rapture. The devil's not concerned about that. What he's concerned about is you don't follow the truth. Get the idea? That's what the devil's about. And so he has scattered like seed all these ideas. And the different ones appeal to different people. But they're all counterfeits. You know, in the year 1844 and the years following that, the people of God who came out of the disappointment had a great burden in their heart as they began to learn about the coming of Jesus and the sanctuary and the state of the dead and all of these other wonderful truths. As they got to learn about them, they had a great desire to share it around the world, because the three angels' messages said it must go to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And they became convinced that their great missionary work needed to be done. And in the year, in fact, May 24, 1844, an amazing discovery took place. It was made by a man by the name of Samuel Morse. Ever heard of? You've probably not know his name, Samuel Morse, but we all know about what? Morse code. That was invented, the telegraph was invented on May 24, 1844, the very year that God's message now needed to go out to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. God allowed a discovery. In fact, it was Samuel Morse and his friend Albert Weil. They were Morse was in the federal law courts in Washington, D.C., and Weil went down to Baltimore, about 15 miles away. And Samuel typed out on his little crude telegraph. And then when it was received by Albert Weil over there in Baltimore, he typed on his little crude telegraph. He returned the words. And you know what the words were? What do you think Samuel Morse typed on the first words that ever went over the telegraph? What were the words? What hath God wrought? Because you see, Samuel Morse was a far greater Bible student than he was an inventor of the telegraph. He loved Daniel and Revelation. As I said, most of his time was spent in the studies of Daniel and Revelation, not on Morse code. That was a byproduct. And as a result of that discovery, all our modern communication arose from that. We wouldn't have the internet today if it wasn't for the foundation that was laid by Samuel Morse. And the decade of the 1840s is the most exciting decade of this world. Let me just read you to some more of the discoveries that were made in that period. We have talked about the Morse code. Now the railroads. This is when trains, steam was invented. This is when the ocean-going steamships began. As we said, the electric telegraph. This was the time when the penny post was discovered. Now, once again, because we don't often think about the past, up until the 1840s, the only people who could ever afford to post a letter were the very, very rich people, because someone had to actually physically take the letter and give it to the person that it was sent to. So you can imagine how much that would cost today if that was the way the letter had to be sent. But in the 1840s, the penny post in England was invented, which meant that 1 penny, any person now could afford to post a letter, and it went all over England. That was in the 1840s. This is when photography with negatives was discovered. This is when sanitation was discovered. Do you know, prior to the 1840s, sanitation as we understand it didn't exist. Let me give you an illustration. I went over to Edinburgh a number of years ago, and I'll tell you where this place is, where this museum is. It's just down from, you know where they have the tattoo every year? You know what I mean by the tattoo? Where they have all this marching and so forth. Brilliant. That's the castle. And this little museum is just down the road from that castle. And I walked in there, and as I walked into the, what looks like a shop now, but it's a museum, as I walked in there was a pig, not a real one, but a stone pig that they'd made. There it was at the door, and I'll come back to that pig in just a moment. When I walked in, I saw what I could hardly believe. Everything in that world, everything in that family was done in one room. And right in the middle of the room was a potty. Now, you only have to let your mind start to think about things. I'm saying everything that happened in a family was done in one room. That room. And in the middle of the room was the potty. And the potty was emptied at midnight. And what they would do is they would take the potty, and in the top room, they would throw it over the balcony, that is, the contents would be thrown over the balcony onto the street below. And when I walked in, I noticed they had shoes on the wall showing how they walked back in those days. The shoes on the top looked like our shoes, but underneath they had a rise like this. So they were actually a lot taller than they really were, because why did they have risers on the bottom of their shoes? So that they could walk on the footpath. And this is Europe. This is England. This is Scotland. And it wasn't until the 1840s that we discovered sanitation. And how thankful we are that we don't have to live like that today. But that wasn't that many years ago. And something else that took place. In the 1840s, another amazing discovery took place. Because God wanted to encourage those people who had been so discouraged about the fact that Jesus didn't come, because people were saying, oh, the Bible's not true, you can't rely on it, it's been written for a long time and they've copyist errors and so forth. And God allowed an amazing discovery to take place. It was in the 1846, 2 years after 1844, the discovery of modern archaeology took place. And the first great discovery was in 1846. It was the first time that anything had been discovered that supported the Bible story from outside the Bible. And this is what it is. It was the obelisk You can see this today in the British Museum. And this obelisk, if you can see that second row down, if you've got good eyes, in fact, I think we're going to give you a close-up of it in a moment. It's the record of King Jehu, the son of Omri, who is prostrating himself. Can we get a picture closer up? Prostrating himself, bowing down before the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. And this was the first discovery of a whole line of discoveries that were going to take place after this, but this is the first one. 1846, the very decade when God's people needed to have encouragement that the Bible was true. And what an amazing discovery it was to encourage the sagging spirits of some of God's people. Discovery after discovery. And I believe these discoveries, and as we think about it today, this is why this subject is so important for us, because it shows beyond all question that it doesn't just depend upon Daniel 8:14. It shows that the devil was very interested in that period of time. And if you think that I'm exaggerating a little, I would encourage you to do a little research yourself on 1844 and see all the amazing discoveries that have taken place. And today, the devil is trying to attack God's people. He's trying to attack them to make them unsure of what we believe. Listen to this from someone whose word I regard. Listen to this. As the Lord's people show their determination to follow the light that has been given, the enemy brings all his powers to bear to discourage them. But they are not to give up because of the difficulties that arise when they try to follow the counsels of the Lord. Isn't that good counsel? But not to be discouraged because we've got some person teaching this or some person saying that. It's what the Bible says. And the Bible says it plainly and simply. And we don't have to interpret the Bible and read into it what it doesn't say. The Bible is simple and clear. And just as in the type, God had a message that finally succeeded, God has a message today that is finally going to go through to the pearly gates. And today, as we study these points, it gives me encouragement. It should give you encouragement, and I hope it does, for us to understand all these amazing discoveries. No wonder we advertise the year that changed the modern world. No year has had more significance in the modern world than 1844. And God has given to us truth, a wonderful truth. And in these last days, he's wanting us to be faithful, to stand faithfully for what we know to be right. And as God leads us and God impresses us, and as we go forward to help people to understand this truth, it gives us courage that indeed we are not following fables or fairy tales. And my prayer this morning is that God will give us courage to study for ourselves, not just take someone else's word, study it for yourself. Look into these things. I'm not suggesting that Google's a good place to be spending a lot of time, but I tell you, the wonderful thing today is that you don't have to go down to the library. You can go to Google and find out a lot of these things. If you Google it, you'll find what I've been sharing with you today is true. And my prayer is that God will help us to be faithful to the cause that he has called us to. And if some of us are getting new and finding our way, I want to encourage you that the Lord has brought you here. You're not here by accident. God has brought you here to hear these truths. And as those truths are brought to our hearts, that God will help us to follow it and then share it with others. I've chosen a hymn to finish our service today, which is a beautiful hymn, and we're going to sing it together. So if you, the song leaders can come out, and then Daniel's going to play the organ, and I think John's going to play the cornet. Is that right? What's the name of it again?